What would you do?
Would you listen when I'm spitting now?
What would
Look
you
at the world and think,
do?
shit, I'm gonna have to sit him down.
What would you do?
Would you listen when I'm spitting now?
What would
Look
you
at the world and think,
do?
shit, I'm gonna have to sit him
Yo,
down.
what would be the approach if I told you that the whole world was being choked? It's no joke. Fumes and gases like human traffic. You could make a boom when you crack a matchstick. This shit's tragic. What would you do if the world spun in reverse when you were young? Would you have become words, or would you listen when I'm spitting now? Look at the crowd and think, shit, I'm gonna have to sit them down. Would you talk to them, explain your thoughts to them, walk with them, show how to enforce a pen? This is the force of my mental cycle. I'm meant to talk on beats, I can invent the right to. See, I'm teaching this. If you wound up in my class, could you have a seat and shit? And would you ever treat a beat like a girlfriend? And would you ever tell me if the world ends?
What would you do?
Would you listen when I'm spitting now?
What would
Look
you
at the world and think,
do?
shit, I'm gonna have to sit him down.
What would you do?
Would you listen when I'm spitting now?
What would
Look
you
at the world and think,
do?
shit, I'm gonna have to sit him down.
Tell me, what would you do if your life was ending and your existence revolved on one final sentence? Would you repent or would you go on relentless? Would you invent or would you listen to your senses? What would be the plan of action if you had to get quickly to a CAT scan but your van had zero traction? Would you run all of the way, man? Or would you stay and get classed as a waste man? What would you do if you got run down quickly? Both legs broken, dislocated hip speed. Would you say, I gotta get to my feet before the next car comes along and then it hits me? What would you do if some kid comes in your school with a shooter and says, I wanna do them all? Would you run and flee? Or would you stand up and say, I ain't afraid of no fucking geek?
What would you do?
Would you listen when I'm spitting now?
What would
Look
you
at the world and think,
do?
shit, I'm gonna have to sit him down.
What would you do?
Would you listen when I'm spitting now?
What would
Look
you
at the world and think,
do?
shit, I'm gonna have to sit him down.
What would you do?
I don't even know, like, I'm asking the questions, like, I really don't have no answers, like, I say my words, but I don't mean
What
it,
would you do?
like, on a level, I don't know.
Yo, what would you do if you were losing a plot? Would you loosen a knot? Would you agree you'll never move to the top? If you're planning to give up all hope of where you wanna be in the world, bruv, don't. Would you move to the south of Spain, the other end of the scale, all drought, no rain? If you were given the cash, would you stay for the love or would you quit spitting raps? Would you move with the sleazy cats just to run up on the street and get easy gash? Or would you see, no one really needs that, grab a good seat and start leaning back? Would you try and write a verse with the world's worst pen? Would you ever curse at your first friend? Would you ever treat a beat like a girlfriend? And would you ever tell me if the world ends?
What would you do?
Would you listen when I'm spitting now?
What would
Look
you
at the world and think,
do?
shit, I'm gonna have to sit him down.
What would you do?
Would you listen when I'm spitting now?
What would
Look
you
at the world and think,
do?
shit, I'm gonna have to sit him down.
What would you do?
Would you listen when I'm spitting now?
What would
Look
you
at the world
do?